Hello YouTube! In my recent discussion with perspective philosophy, I briefly mentioned that one reason why anti-realism about morality is appealing is that morality may simply be incoherent. This isn't an idea that has received a lot of discussion in the literature, but a recent paper by Christopher Cowie called A New Argument for Moral Error Theory was pointed out to me, in which he makes exactly this argument. So the standard arguments for moral anti-realism appeal to metaphysical and epistemological concerns. Think of things like the queerness argument or the evolutionary debunking argument. I discuss all of these in my series on meta-ethics. Now, the idea of this incoherence argument, the argument from first order incoherence, is that morality contains some kind of ineliminable inconsistency in our first-order moral judgments. There are aspects of moral thinking that are fundamental to it, but that are incompatible. And then the claim is that if morality is inconsistent in this way, our moral claims cannot be true, because something's inconsistent can't be true. So first I'll explain my thinking on this, and then I'll turn to Cowie's version of the argument. So a couple of weeks ago, I came across a line in a paper by Thomas Nagel. The paper was called War and Massacre. Obviously, Nagel wasn't arguing for moral anti-realism, but there was a passage in there that just kind of struck me and got me thinking. Nagel was talking about moral dilemmas that result from the conflict between consequentialist and deontological intuitions. I'm sure you're all familiar with these kinds of cases. For a consequentialist theory like utilitarianism, you have a case such as organ stealing. Suppose that there are 10 people who all need organs and a doctor could take organs from one healthy person. Then you sacrifice one life to save 10, which would maximise utility. Or take the case in which a terrible crime has been committed and the failure of the justice system to locate the criminal is leading to violent, destructive riots. The police decide to frame an innocent man in order to restore peace. Again, arguably that would maximise utility. Of course, consequentialists have responses to these cases, but you can come up with others. And these kinds of scenarios tend to push people towards deontological theories, according to which there are certain actions that ought not to be done, regardless of how good the longer-term consequences might be. The moral status of an action depends on the intrinsic nature of the action. People have rights, such as a right to life, and we have corresponding duties to respect those rights. We cannot violate a person's right to life even if this will save the lives of a greater number of people overall. On deontological theories, moral action involves conformity with moral rules. But of course, deontological theories generate deeply counterintuitive consequences as well. What if there is some scenario in which you have to kill one person to save 1,000 or to save 10,000? Once the consequences become great enough, the consequentialist calculation looks much more attractive. Anyway, Nagel is talking about these kinds of cases, and here's what he says. And I quote, "There may exist principles not yet codified, which would enable us to resolve such dilemmas. But then again, they may not. We must face the pessimistic alternative, that these two forms of moral intuition are not capable of being brought together into a single coherent moral system, and that the world can present us with situations in which there is no honourable or moral course for a man to take." Now, obviously, as I say, Nagel doesn't draw any kind of anti-realist conclusion from this in that paper, but it seems to me that if we accept this line of thought, then we may well have a fairly straightforward argument against moral realism. The idea is this. Consequentialism and deontology represent two fundamental aspects of our moral reasoning. They are two fundamentally different kinds of moral reasoning, and morality, what we call morality, is a combination of both. Moral judgments are a product of both. When we are presented with moral problems, with the question of what we ought to do, either one of these ways of reasoning, or sometimes both at once, may be activated. Speaking generally, a useful way to, or maybe another way to look at the distinction here, the distinction in the different kinds of reasoning, and this comes from Philip Petit, is the distinction between promoting and honouring values. So every moral theory has two components. The first is that it will specify what is good or bad. It will specify what kinds of states of affairs are valuable. So, the valuable things might include pleasure, life, liberty, social relationships, knowledge, and so on. But then second, moral theory must tell us how to act with respect to what is valuable. This is the distinction between promoting and honouring. To promote a value involves acting in such a way as to maximise the occurrence of that value, even if in your own actions you are doing things that are contrary to that value. So suppose we take it that life is valuable, death is bad. To promote that value, you would do all you could to reduce death, even if that meant imposing death on some people so that a greater number may live. By contrast, honouring a value means bringing about that value directly in your own conduct. So to honour the value of life, you would avoid imposing death on anyone. You would not, in any of your actions, kill any person, even if that would end up resulting in a greater amount of death overall. So there's these two ways of acting with respect to values, and the claim here is moral reasoning drives us to both promote and to honour values. Consequentialism, of course, is kind of arises from that drive to promote values, while deontology tends to arise from the drive to honour the values. So the claim is that these are both sort of deep fundamental features of our moral thought, and of course this is why consequentialism and deontology strike people as very attractive. It's why there's such great debate between these two positions, and why even once you accept a theory, it's very often you kind of still feel the pull of the other theory. Like even the most hardcore consequentialist will probably feel the pull of the intuitions that drive deontology, and vice versa. When you present consequentialists with counterintuitive scenarios like the organ stealing case, I mean, it's pretty rare that they will just bite the bullet and say that the organs should be stolen. And even when they do bite the bullet, they usually recognise it as bullet biting. Clearly that's an uncomfortable conclusion. Of course, the same is true for the deontologist when you make the consequences significant enough. So, this point hopefully isn't too controversial, right? It appears that when people engage in moral reasoning, right, they have this drive to both promote and to honour. So these are sort of two fundamental aspects of moral reasoning. And this picture of moral reasoning perhaps has some, empirical support. We can draw on work on dual process theory, which has been defended most prominently by Joshua Green. According to dual process theory, there are two separate cognitive systems that compete when we engage in moral reasoning. One of them is fast, emotional, intuitive, and tends to support deontological judgments. The other is slow, involves conscious calculation and reasoning in which we weigh up the costs and benefits of actions, and that tends to elicit consequentialist judgments. Experiments to test this theory involved presenting subjects with variations on the trolley problem. So, in the standard trolley problem, you've got 5 people stuck on a track, trolley coming towards them. You can switch the trolley to another track where there's 1 person who will be killed instead of 5. In that case, most people favour switching, because after all, killing 1 life to save 5 seems worth it. By contrast, there is the fat man trolley case. 5 people on a track with a trolley about to kill them. Standing over the track on a footbridge is a fat man. You can push the fat man onto the track to derail the trolley, which will save the 5 but kill the 1. Again, 5 lives saved is greater than 1 life. But the idea of literally pushing a person, physically pushing them onto the track, that invokes emotional resistance. Your personal involvement in the second case seems somehow greater. Unsurprisingly, a lot of people say it would be morally wrong to push the fat man. And brain imaging studies conducted by Joshua Green on people who are given these dilemmas show that different areas of the brain are activated for the impersonal dilemmas, such as the switch case, versus the personal dilemmas, such as the fat man case. When presented with impersonal dilemmas, people show greater activity in areas associated with cognitive processing, the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the parietal lobe, for example. For the personal dilemmas, there is greater activity in the parts of the brain that are associated with emotional processing, such as the medial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. Along the same lines, in brain lesion studies, we find that people with damage to the brain areas associated with emotional processing are more likely to issue utilitarian judgments, even in the personal scenarios. So in people who have damage to the areas with emotional processing, they're more likely to judge that it's morally acceptable to push the fat man. There are various other lines of evidence for the theory. Of course, it's also, it's a controversial theory, this. But, the basic idea of two separate moral systems seems plausible, right? Like sometimes our emotions guide us. In other cases, where emotions tend not to be activated, maybe we simply weigh up utilities. When personal factors are involved, the emotional processing kicks in and perhaps blocks the conscious, rational calculation. So, anyway, the hopefully plausible claim here is that morality consists of two separate types of reasoning, consequentialist and deontological. Maybe another way to put it is morality aims at two separate things, promoting and honouring values. The problem, of course, is that these two aspects of moral reasoning are incompatible. You cannot both promote and honour your values. Sometimes these will issue in the same judgments, but very often pursuing one of these projects will involve violating the other. And of course, this is exactly why the more formal theories of consequentialism and deontology end up generating deeply counterintuitive results in various specific scenarios. We have two forms of moral reasoning that systematically generate incompatible intuitions. So, there is an inconsistency fundamental to moral thinking. Consequentialism and deontology are both fundamental to morality, but they are incompatible. Morality is inconsistent. And, we're assuming that, well, if it's inconsistent, it can't be true. There cannot be a true moral theory. We're putting aside views like dialetheism here, so, assuming there can't be true contradictions. That's the basic idea. That's the basic suggestion. At least that was the thought that I had concerning the incoherence of morality. Now, of course, one response to this situation is just to say, well, look, we haven't yet found the correct moral theory. This is the project of moral philosophy. Moral philosophers proceed by proposing what seem to be plausible general moral principles, and then we test those principles against our intuitions about specific cases, and then sometimes we revise our principles, sometimes we reject our intuitions. We bear in mind general constraints on theory choice, like simplicity and ease of applicability, so we're sort of weighing up the principles against the intuitions, again bearing in mind constraints of simplicity and so on. And over time, we will arrive at an overall coherent system that respects a large enough number of our moral intuitions. Of course, we haven't got there yet, but we just have to keep trying, right? After all, morality is hardly the only domain in which there are competing theories. If you look at, say, the history of cosmology and all the different theories of the nature and origin of the universe, the answer when we face competing theories is not that some domain is incoherent. It's not that cosmology is incoherent. It's just that, okay, most of the theories are wrong. Maybe all of the theories we've thought of so far are wrong, and we just haven't yet found the right one. Well, we just have to keep working. So we might take the kind of same line here, just to say that all this really shows is, we haven't found the right theory yet. But it's not so clear that this kind of optimism is reasonable in the case of morality. So the basic problem is that with morality, we have little more to go on in judging competing theories than our moral intuitions. Plus, I guess, certain conceptual truths, right? Like we have to bear in mind analytic truths that follow from moral concepts and so on. But at the very least, right, moral intuitions seem to play an essential role in deciding between different moral theories. We propose a moral principle, and then somebody else comes up with a case in which that principle entails counterintuitive consequences, and then, we revise the principle. So we're using moral intuitions as the kind of basic source of evidence here. And it's not clear how we could avoid doing that. After all, we don't, discover moral value or moral reasons by like pointing a telescope at things or using any other instrument or anything like that. We can't use moral theories to like make predictions and construct instruments to test those predictions, or at least, I guess the only predictions we can make are predictions about what people's intuitions about cases might be. Ultimately it looks like these kind of intellectual intuitions are playing a pretty significant role in deciding what moral theories are acceptable. But the issue is, well, we already know that people have both the consequentialist and the deontological intuitions. We know that people have at least two seemingly separate types of reasoning that they apply in their moral thinking, and that these separate systems generate incompatible answers. Now, there have, of course, been plenty of attempts to combine these two pillars coherently. Think of rule utilitarianism or threshold deontology. There are plenty of philosophers who think that a coherent moral theory is within our grasp, and a theory that will respect both the consequentialist and the deontological intuitions appropriately. Obviously, I'm not in this video going to explore all of this. That would require a whole series, right? I'd just be doing ethics at that point. But suffice it to say that every attempt that has been made so far has failed to achieve any consensus, and every attempt so far continues to have various seriously counterintuitive implications. An anti-realist might look at this and be pessimistic, I suppose. It seems like pessimism is at least a plausible response to this situation. Okay, so another way we might respond to the incoherence challenge, another way the realist might respond, is to grant that our present moral thinking involves at least two incompatible systems, but then to argue that the proper response to this is just to radically reform morality. So we might say, for instance, that we should become consequentialists, and so eliminate that fundamental aspect of our moral thinking that is found in the deontological system, let's say. We might think that there are good reasons for simply ignoring the deontological intuitions, and so we take it that only the consequentialist reasoning generates, or at least tracks, the moral facts. Of course, if we all became hardcore consequentialists, morality would no longer be incoherent, and the incoherence argument could be rejected. This, by the way, is basically the position of Joshua Green, who proposed the dual process theory. So he thinks that the fast emotional system, which generates the deontological judgments, he thinks that's really a kind of useful heuristic, right? Ideally, we should always try to maximize the good, right? We should kind of take that consequentialist line, just promote the good. But obviously, the world in which we live is extraordinarily complex, and our cognitive powers are very limited. So we're often unable to work out all of the relevant consequences of our actions. And sometimes we're just in situations where we have to act fast. So we are endowed with a module that kind of operates on useful, simplified rules. It produces immediate emotional judgments that make us act quickly. And that's very useful in everyday life, but we shouldn't think that they are really that they're ideal for tracking moral facts. Again, it's like a useful heuristic, right? That's how we should think of the kind of deontological intuitions. But really, it's the consequentialist reasoning that gets at what the moral facts are. So, this kind of line is certainly an option in principle. If there is an incoherence in our concepts in a given domain, then of course we always have the option of reforming the concepts. I guess there are two concerns here. Well, at least two concerns. I suppose you might come up with more, but at least two concerns. So one general concern about radical conceptual revision is we might think, well, really, what all you've done is to simply eliminate the concept. So if it's true that consequentialism and deontology are fundamental to morality, and then you decide, okay, we're just going to remove the deontological parts of the concept, let's say, we might wonder whether you're really talking about morality anymore. So suppose I tell you that I believe in God, but then you inquire about what exactly it is I believe in, and all I'm prepared to affirm is that there's an entity that is omnipotent and omniscient. Maybe this entity doesn't care about us, maybe this entity is evil and it intentionally created a particularly bad world. Well, in that case, you might wonder whether I'm really talking about God here. Perhaps I've done too much violence to the concept, or I've done so much violence to it that I'm really talking about something else. This kind of thing will always be a concern for people who are proposing conceptual revisions. I don't think this is actually too much of a problem, really. I recommend checking out my video on conceptual engineering for more here, but I just flagged this up as an objection that some people might raise. A second concern is that this approach may well just be it may well be difficult to sustain, certainly in the moral case. It may well be that this radical revision of our moral concepts is just not psychologically supportable. So it may be that most people are just unable to avoid thinking in terms of both of these systems. These are very deep features of our moral psychology. You can, of course, propose a thoroughly consequentialist theory and just reject the deontological intuitions, but that's likely to be rather uncomfortable. Moreover, it's unlikely that you'll be able to persuade the majority of other people. Most people feel that consequentialism misses something fundamental and important about morality. And of course, the same is true for deontology. So the proposed conceptual revision may be psychologically difficult to sustain, may be difficult to actually get people to use the concept in the way that you are proposing. Indeed, it might be that a thoroughly consequentialist theory is not even conceivable, or at least a theory which, say, removes the emotional processing is not even conceivable. At a certain point, perhaps we have no choice but to engage in the emotional processes. For example, how do we select what we should maximise? Should I maximise the welfare of everybody or only my own welfare? Emotions may play a role in getting us to look beyond ourselves to the welfare of other people. Also, amusingly, the one class of moral theories that are famous for deriving moral rules from a purely prudential, self-interested basis, the contractarian theories, they tend to have deontological conclusions. So, okay, anyway, the point is this. Here is the general suggestion then. Suppose that the following are true. So, number one, consequentialism and deontology, or perhaps the cognitive systems underlying them, are fundamental to our moral thinking. Moral judgments are a product of at least two cognitive systems, one of which produces consequentialist judgments, the other tends to produce deontological judgments, one of which is concerned with promoting, the other concerned with honouring. Two, consequentialism and deontology are incompatible. You cannot both promote and honour the relevant values. There will be situations where they clash. And the attempts to develop moral theories that combine the two will fail because they are fundamentally incompatible. Three, consequentialism and deontology are ineliminable. When people ask themselves what they ought to do, or when they judge the behaviour of others, most of them are just unable to avoid engaging both systems. So we can't revise the concept, the moral concept, to eliminate either one of them, right? Any moral theory would need to be a product of both systems. These claims are all very controversial, but they are defensible at least. And the key thing is, if they are all true, then morality is inconsistent, and there you have it. Morality is incoherent, and it's very hard to see how the incoherency could be removed. And this is not to say that we should stop making moral judgments. Indeed, per the third point, that both parts are ineliminable, per that point, it will be that moral thinking is just inescapable, right? We can't help but make moral judgments. But we will be forced, when we reflect on those judgments, we'll be forced to view it as a kind of fiction. And this is not because of any difficult metaphysical or epistemological considerations. It's simply because morality has an ineliminable first-order inconsistency. So yeah, that was basically that's a skeleton of an argument, let's say, that I had in mind, and maybe that will give people something to think about. Now, there may well be other sources of moral incoherence. Another point that has been raised by quite a few philosophers, actually, for example, Richard Joyce has made this point, is that moral judgments seem to imply notions of free will and moral responsibility that may be incoherent. Many moral judgments involve making claims about what people ought and ought not to do. Now, a general assumption held by many ethicists and meta-ethicists is that ought implies can. To say that an agent ought to do X entails that the agent can do X. So to say that I ought to give money to charity implies that I can give money to charity, or if I ought to refrain from killing, then I can refrain from killing. It just makes no sense, many philosophers think, to suppose that people could have obligations that it is not possible for them to fulfill. This is known as the ought implies can principle. I do have a video on ought implies can if you're interested in more here, and if you're interested in particular in the challenges to that, because it has been challenged. But as I say, this principle is pretty widely accepted. And arguably this entails that I need to have free will. After all, I can do X or not X only if I'm free to choose either X or not X. And this suggests a straightforward argument for antirealism. There are many philosophers who doubt whether anybody has free will. The claim will be that, look, nobody can... So if somebody denies the existence of free will, then the claim will be that nobody can do anything other than what they actually do. Nobody has any genuine control over their actions. If this is right, and if we accept the ought implies can principle, then we can't really intelligibly make any claims about how people ought to act. So Galen Strawson is probably the most prominent defender of the view that free will is incoherent. Here is what Strawson calls his basic argument. Premise 1, nothing can be the cause of itself. Premise 2, in order to be morally responsible for their actions, a person would have to be the cause of themselves. So conclusion, nobody is morally responsible for their actions. The incoherency in free will then is in this notion of something being the cause of itself. So let's outline sort of Strawson's argument here in a bit more detail. It essentially involves 5 steps. So first of all then, the idea is, look, you do what you do because of the way you are, right? Because of your nature or your character. So your actions flow from your desires, your values, your preferences, your reasoning, and so on. Your actions are a product of the way that your mind is, the way that you are. Second, to be truly responsible for what you do, you must therefore be truly responsible for the way that you are. Right, so since my actions flow from my state of mind, then in order to be responsible for my actions, in order to have control over my actions, I must in some sense be responsible for my state of mind, for the way that I am. Third, to be truly responsible for the way that you are, you must have done something in the past for which you were also responsible to make yourself, at least in part, the way you are. So, to be responsible for the way I am at time t, then at some prior time t-1, I must have done something to make myself the way I am at t. 4, if you were truly responsible for doing something in the past to make yourself the way you are now, you must have been responsible for the way you were then, at that earlier time. You must have been responsible for your nature or your character, or like your values, preferences, desires. You must in some sense have been responsible for the way you were back then. 5, to have been responsible for the way you were at that earlier time, you must have done something for which you were responsible at a still earlier time to make yourself the way you were at that earlier time, and so on backward. And here, obviously, we're off on an infinite regress. Obviously, this can't go on forever. And eventually, as we go back and back and back, eventually we're just going to find our way back to various causal factors that obtained before the individual was even born. And at no point here is there any place at which genuine free will, genuine control over one's own actions emerges. There's another way to approach this point, to approach this idea. So you are the way you are initially as a result of your genetics, your experience, and I guess perhaps also random or indeterministic factors in your brain on like a quantum level, right? I mean, I guess there's going to be some things that just go on, at the quantum level in your head that have an impact. But it's totally uncontroversial that you can't be held responsible for any of these things. You didn't choose your genetics, you didn't choose your initial experiences, you didn't choose that a particular particle would make a random movement at the time that it did. So you do not have any control over, you cannot be held responsible for the way you initially are. Now you can of course try to change yourself over time, but the direction in which you try to change, the methods you use for changing yourself, and your success at changing yourself, all of this will, again, be a product of the way you initially are, and so a product of a combination of factors all outside of your control. You can never change yourself in such a way as to become morally responsible for the way you are, because you're never responsible for the initial state nor for any of the changes. So you don't have free will. All of your actions are a product of factors that are ultimately outside of your control. You can't do anything other than what you actually do. Like if I go out and stab somebody and you say, hey, you ought not to have done that, well, that implies that I had a genuine choice in the matter, that I could have chosen something other than the stabbing. And this, the claim will be, rests on the incoherent idea that I can somehow be the cause of myself. But of course, I'm not the cause of myself. What has caused this is just a whole bunch of factors that are completely outside of my control, that I can't be held responsible for. Obviously, there are plenty of potential responses to this kind of argument. For one thing, we can doubt this particular claim about free will. There are plenty of people who will defend compatibilist accounts of free will, or libertarian accounts of free will. There are alternative views here. But we might also focus on the ought implies can principle. When we say that a person can do X, we might object that this doesn't really involve any notion of free will at all. Perhaps what we mean really is just that X is logically possible, or that X is possible given certain physical and biological constraints. So I have the strength to, and the dexterity to lift the rock in front of me, let's say. Maybe I never actually lift the rock, maybe I don't have any genuine free will, so I can't really choose whether or not to lift the rock, but I still have the ability to do so. I mean, just in terms of like the kind of biological capacities. In the same way, if we build a robot, the robot can lift the rock, but we wouldn't take this to imply that the robot has free will in any sense. So the robot can do it, right? But this doesn't imply that it has any kind of free will. So, the can in the ought implies can doesn't require any notion of free will. However, this analogy to the robot can be used by the moral incoherentist also. Suppose the robot malfunctions and crushes a person to death. We would think that this is a bad outcome, but it would be very odd to say that the robot morally ought not to have crushed the person. The same is true for animals and natural phenomena. If a boulder rolls down a hill and kills somebody, it would be pretty odd to pass any kind of moral judgment about what the boulder did, to say that the boulder behaved morally wrongly or that the boulder ought not to have killed the person. Robots, animals, natural objects, these things don't have any moral obligations. And the natural explanation for this is that the reason why they don't have any moral obligations is because they don't have any genuine control over their behaviour. They are products of causal forces over which they have no control. So that's it. That's why it would be odd to talk about like robots and boulders as having things that they are obligated to do and not to do. So this then suggests that moral obligations actually do involve a concept of free will, of control over one's own actions. Okay then, so that's obviously pretty brief and no doubt controversial, but that is another potential source of moral incoherence. Incoherence in first order moral judgments. So just in the judgment say that you ought not to own slaves. If that claim, the ought implies a notion of free will which is incoherent, then morality turns out to be incoherent. Okay then, let's turn to the paper by Christopher Cowie. This is a paper called A New Argument for Moral Error Theory. As I mentioned, Cowie makes this same general claim, that morality is incoherent in its first order moral judgments. But to show this, he appeals to results from population axiology. I'd recommend checking out my video on the repugnant conclusion if you're not familiar with this topic. I think it will make Cowie's argument much more intuitively understandable. Anyway, population axiology is the study of the conditions in which one population is better than another. And there's an important result in this field known as the axiological impossibility theorem. There are 5 propositions which are individually extremely plausible, but which can be proven to be mutually inconsistent. So it can't be the case that all 5 propositions are true. And Cowie uses this as the basis for his anti-realist argument. He uses this to show, or try to show, that morality is incoherent. So let's go through these propositions. And some of these are kind of abstract, kind of technical, but when you sort of get what they're saying, they are extremely intuitive. It's like, as I say, extremely hard to deny them. So, first of all, the egalitarian dominance condition, which says that if population A is a perfectly equal population of the same size as population B, and every person in A has higher welfare than every person in B, then A is better than B, other things being equal. So in other words, take 2 populations, each of which is perfectly equal in its welfare level, but the welfare of everybody in the first is higher than the welfare of everybody in the second. Then this condition claims that the first population is better than the second, right? It's better for a population to have higher welfare than lower welfare. Well, that seems obvious enough, right? Better to have higher welfare than lower welfare. Second, the weak non-sadism condition. There is a negative welfare level and a number of lives at this level, such that an addition of any number of people with positive welfare is at least as good as an addition of the lives with negative welfare, other things being equal. So basically this is just saying that adding lives of positive welfare to a population does not make it worse than adding lives of negative welfare. So to deny this, you would need to hold that it is sometimes better to add lives of negative welfare than to add lives of positive welfare. Again, this looks like an extremely plausible principle. It would seem very odd to deny this. Okay, this third proposition sounds complex, but again, once you properly understand it, it's hopefully intuitive. This is the general non-extreme priority condition. So, for any welfare level A and any population X, there is a number n of lives such that a population consisting of the X lives, n lives with very high welfare, and 1 life with welfare A is at least as good as a population consisting of the X lives, n lives with very low positive welfare, and 1 life with welfare slightly above A, other things being equal. Okay, what the hell does all of that mean? Well, consider 2 populations, each of which has the same number of people. In the first population, everybody has very good lives. Let's say the overall quality of their lives is 8 out of 10. So, not like the best, but very, very good. And then there's one person with a life of 6 out of 10. And 6 out of 10 is welfare level A. In the second population, everybody has lives that are of overall positive welfare, but that are just fairly kind of crummy, right? So their welfare level is like 1 out of 10. And we're assuming we can go into negative numbers here. So, 1 out of 10 is still positive welfare. It's like, it's not a bad life, right? It's still a life worth living, right? It's not like, just constant torture and suffering, but it's kind of dull, boring, long work hours, low pay, that kind of thing. But there's one person whose life is marginally better than the unlucky person in population 1. So there's one person whose life is of quality 7 out of 10. Okay, what this condition says, the general non-extreme priority condition, what this says is that the first population is at least as good as the second. Right, so to deny this condition, you would need to hold that the second population is a better state of affairs than the first. That's kind of the thing that this is getting at. So again, hopefully that seems intuitive to you. Okay, fourth, the weak quality addition condition. For any population X, there is a perfectly equal population with very high positive welfare and a very negative welfare and a number of lives at this level, such that the addition of the high welfare population to X is at least as good as the addition of any population consisting of the lives with negative welfare and any number of lives with very low positive welfare to X, other things being equal. Again, what does all this mean? Well, basically this tells us that adding lives of high welfare to the population is at least as good as adding a mixture of low welfare and negative welfare lives. So, like, suppose you've got a bunch of excellent lives on the one hand, and on the other hand, you've got a bunch of people who are just suffering horribly. Their welfare is like -10, and then you've got a whole load of people with lives that, again, are like 1 out of 10. So it's maybe not awful, but like just really lame. What this condition tells us is that it's at least as good to add the excellent lives than the terrible ones and the lame ones together. The final proposition, non-elitism. This is the technical statement of... I'm not going to keep on reading this stuff out, actually. You can pause it and read it. Essentially what this says is take two populations where everyone at the first population is much better off than the second. Then non-elitism tells us that adding just one person to the second population who is marginally better off than everybody at the first does not make the second population better than the first. So suppose the first contains like 10 million people with welfare level 8 out of 10, and the second contains the same number with welfare level 1 out of 10, then the claim is that adding one person to the second population whose welfare is 9 out of 10 does not make the second better than the first. Okay, right. Now, as I said, these propositions, yes, they're rather abstract and technical. One reason why they're stated in this way is partly to make them as weak as possible, and the other reason is so that the inconsistency can be formally proven. But once you properly grasp them, once you grasp what's actually being said in these propositions, they all look extremely hard to deny. And the problem is, of course, that they're mutually inconsistent. I won't go into all of that here. The inconsistency has been proven by Gustav Arrhenius in his work Population Ethics: The Challenge of Future Generations. But, it's the point for our purposes is it's not possible for all of these propositions to be true. Again, assuming we're ignoring dialetheism. So one of them has to go. And then here's Cowie's basic argument for anti-realism. If the propositions that constitute the impossibility proof aren't all true, then no moral propositions are true. The propositions that constitute the impossibility proof aren't all true, so no moral propositions are true. Well, the main question here is, why on earth would anyone believe premise 1? After all, at first sight, the impossibility proof might not seem like such a significant problem. There's obviously a challenge here, but the challenge is just to identify which of these propositions is false. Then we reject the false proposition and we have a coherent moral theory. Obviously, rejecting any of these propositions will be counterintuitive, but hey, sometimes the facts are counterintuitive. But in Cowie's view, calling the propositions that form the impossibility proof, calling them merely intuitive is an understatement. He says that we are as confident in them as we are in any moral proposition. Presented individually, it's hard to imagine on what grounds a person could hold an alternative moral position. So take egalitarian dominance, right? Essentially the claim that it's better for the population to have higher welfare, other things being equal. It would just seem utterly crazy to deny this. I mean, if somebody rejected this, we might wonder if they had misunderstood what they were being asked, or if they were simply joking. So Cowie says these 5 propositions they're not merely intuitive, right? They are conceptual truths. They are made true, if they're true at all, by the nature of our moral concepts. Their truth is grounded by the essence of concepts like goodness and better than, and they're knowable to anybody who grasps such concepts. This is why they seem so hard to deny. Now, it's important to note that to say that they're conceptual truths does not entail that the relevant concepts are actually instantiated in the world. So they can be conceptual truths even if moral properties do not exist. Conceptual truths only tell us about the nature of our concepts, not about what the world contains. Consider, for example, that it's plausibly a conceptual truth that God is benevolent, because, God is attributed with this property just by definition. Anything that fails to be benevolent would not be God. Or it's a conceptual truth that phlogiston is contained within combustible bodies and released during combustion. Obviously, we would not draw existential inferences from these conceptual truths. Instead, we make a conditional claim. If there is a God, then God is benevolent. If phlogiston exists, then phlogiston is released during combustion. So it is with the conceptual truths of morality. If anything is morally better or worse than anything else, then it is better for a population to have higher welfare than lower welfare. If anything is morally better or worse, then it is better to add lives of positive welfare to a population than to add lives of negative welfare. Conceptual truths are conditionals, so that if anything is X, then such and such is the case. Cowie's claim then is that in the moral case, the consequence of these conditionals are inconsistent. If the 5 propositions are conceptual truths, and yet the 5 propositions are mutually inconsistent, this shows that our moral concepts are defective. If the essence of a concept grounds a contradiction, so if a concept is contradictory, then the people who are making first-order moral judgments using that concept can't be saying anything true. I mean, ignoring cases where you, say that, the concept isn't instantiated, where you say there are no such things. Ignoring cases like that. So consider somebody who tries to express truths about the world by using the concept married bachelor. Maybe they try to explain somebody's behaviour by citing the supposed fact that he was a married bachelor. Or maybe they say that there are several married bachelors staying at this hotel. Well, obviously, we immediately know that these judgments are all false. Again, you could say there are no married bachelors. So there are a few things you can say that would be true. But generally, the first order judgments you make using this concept, we just know that they're all false. Now, in the case of married bachelor, judgments invoking that concept wear their inconsistency on their face. But concepts may be inconsistent in more disguised ways. So the claim will be that moral concepts are also inconsistent, and since all moral judgments employ moral concepts, all moral judgments are going to turn out to be false. So Cowie's basic argument is quite simple, really. There are 2 central claims. First, there's the claim that some moral propositions are conceptual truths. Second, that these propositions are jointly inconsistent. Cowie gives the propositions developed in population axiology as examples, but this same kind of argument could be run with different propositions instead. Now, there is no doubt that the 5 impossibility propositions are inconsistent. At least I don't think there's any doubt about that. Like I say, it's been formally proven, I think. So maybe I shouldn't say there is no doubt, because I haven't actually checked that. But I'm pretty sure that the 5 impossibility propositions are inconsistent. The question then is whether they are conceptual truths. To defend this claim, Cowie appeals to the moral fixed points view, which was proposed by Terence Cuneo and Russ Schaefer-Landau. Cuneo and Schaefer-Landau are realists, but Cowie appeals to their work because they state 4 markers of conceptual truths in moral thinking. So first of all, first marker is of a conceptual truth is that if the proposition is true, then it is necessarily true. Second, it is a framework proposition. So this is to say that it determines the boundaries as to what counts as a type of subject matter. So that if you were to reject the proposition, there would be good reason to suppose that you were not using the concept in question. So, God is omnipotent. If you reject that God is omnipotent, then while then engaging in theological discourse, we would take it that you're not using the standard theistic concept of God. Third, denial of the proposition would provoke bafflement. It's not just that people would disagree, they would be bewildered. They would wonder if they had misunderstood you. Fourth, the proposition is a candidate for being knowable a priori, knowable just by understanding the relevant concepts. All of these markers are, Cowie says, true of the 5 propositions of the impossibility proof. So take egalitarian dominance. As we saw, this is essentially the claim that it's better for a population to have higher welfare than lower welfare. Well, clearly, if that's true, it would be necessarily true. It would hold in every world, in every conceivable circumstance. It's not a moral claim that is specific to the conditions of some given society. It's proposed universally. The second marker here is more open to question, but egalitarian dominance looks like it would fit here if any proposition would. I mean, if somebody says that it's better for a population to have lower welfare, other things being equal, well, I mean, we might well wonder if they're just using a different concept to us. As for the third marker, it straightforwardly meets that one. It would indeed be baffling for somebody to deny egalitarian dominance. The fourth marker also looks like it applies. We don't need to do any empirical work to see that egalitarian dominance must be right. It's just a matter of the relation between concepts like morally better and the concept of welfare. The same points, at least Cowie says, can be made for the other 5 propositions. So there's at least some reason to take them to be conceptual truths. So that's basically Cowie's argument. Now there is an important objection here that might have occurred to you. We noted that it's remarkably hard to deny any of the 5 propositions. This is why Cowie suggests that they are conceptual truths. Indeed, this is why population axiology is so challenging. But if we're anti-realists, then we're going to deny all of these propositions. Cowie is presenting this as an argument for the error theory, so he takes it that all 5 propositions are false. But surely that is a much more counterintuitive position than saying that just one of them is false. Right? So, basically the problem is the realist only denies one of these 5 propositions. That is deeply counterintuitive, but it's surely not anywhere near as counterintuitive as denying all of them, which is Cowie's conclusion. Is this a problem? Well, Cowie puts the point this way. There are 2 options, right? The realist will reject one of the propositions. So she will say that there are some moral truths, but that it is false that of 2 fully egalitarian populations with differing welfare levels, the one in which everybody has a higher welfare is better. So in fact, the realist will say, right, at least if the realist is choosing to reject egalitarian dominance, she will say it's false, right, that higher welfare the population with higher welfare is better than the one with lower welfare. So it's true, right, that the population with lower welfare is better than the one with higher welfare. Right, so the realist is committed to saying it is a moral truth that the lower welfare population is better than the higher welfare population. On the other hand, the anti-realist position here is just that if there were any moral truths, then one of them would be that of 2 fully egalitarian populations with differing welfare levels, the one in which everyone has a higher welfare is better. Right? If there were any moral truths, each of the 5 propositions would hold. But it just turns out that there's a systematic problem with morality, that it is inconsistent, so there are no moral truths. It is not true, right, that it is morally better to have a population with higher rather than lower welfare, but it's also not true that it's better to have a population with lower welfare than higher welfare. So I guess the realist is rejecting at least one of these propositions in a way that the anti-realist is not, because the anti-realist takes them all to be conceptual truths. If there were any moral truths, these 5 propositions would hold, but there just are no moral truths. Whereas the realist has to say, if there were any moral truths, not all of these 5 propositions would hold. In fact, there are moral truths, and not all of the 5 hold. So Cowie says that the anti-realist is not in any obvious disadvantage here with respect to the counterintuitiveness of what she's saying. So those were 3 ways to argue that morality is incoherent. Before we end, I want to note that there are different ways we might present this kind of argument, or different sort of goals we might have with it. So throughout this video, I've presented this as a direct argument for anti-realism. The idea is that moral concepts are incoherent, so there are no moral truths. But we might raise the same kind of concerns, but with a weaker conclusion in mind. We might say, well, look, there are some prima facie reasons to worry that moral concepts are incoherent, or at least moral concepts haven't been shown to be coherent. And so rather than argue directly for anti-realism, we might, I guess, just be raising a challenge, or in particular, we might use this as a way of trying to shift the burden of proof. So many philosophers tend to assume that there is an initial presumption in favour of moral realism. Moral realism is, many people suppose, the common sense moral position. Certainly we all tend to make moral judgments, we all have moral intuitions. Morality is a deep feature of our worldview, and moral reasoning appears to occur in literally every society. Of course, different societies may have very different values, but basically they're all engaging in moral judgments. I'm actually not sure of the anthropological evidence here. Maybe there are some societies that just don't have it, but it seems like the vast majority of them do. So anti-realism is often seen as violating common sense, and this puts the burden on the anti-realist to come up with some persuasive arguments for her position. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as the saying goes, and to say that there are no moral facts, or that no moral claims are true, so to say that it is not a fact that torturing children is wrong, that sounds pretty extraordinary to many people. On the other hand, of course, the realist is the one who's making the existence claim. The realist is the one who is asserting that certain things are part of the furniture of the world. Now, if this existence claim involves commitments that are prima facie incoherent, then that arguably shifts the burden of proof away from the anti-realist. And this is because the realist will need, well, for one reason, this is because the realist will need to avoid the incoherence. And this may involve radically reforming morality, perhaps rejecting a fundamental form of moral reasoning, or perhaps rejecting certain propositions that seem undeniable. The reform may well have to be significant enough that the realist will have to assume that our moral intuitions are systematically misleading. And this undermines the realist's claim that moral realism is the intuitive common sense position. Like, by the realist's own lights, we actually can't trust many of our moral intuitions. So the fact that realism is claimed to respect our moral intuitions no longer has so much force as an argument, right? Like the fact that anti-realism is counterintuitive in particular respects will no longer count so heavily against it, because both camps deny our intuitions and deny common sense in important ways. And of course, there's just the straightforward, I guess, just in a much more straightforward way, right? If somebody is proposing the existence of something which is questionably coherent, then it seems unreasonable to suppose that the burden of proof is on the person who denies the existence of that thing. So yeah, if we can shift the burden of proof away from the anti-realist, then that will at least impact the shape of the debate, right? The realists will now need to do more than just rebut anti-realist challenges. They will need to provide good, positive reasons to accept realism. I suppose the default position in meta-ethics would become just agnosticism, suspend judgment on whether you're a realist or anti-realist, I guess, would be the default. Along the same lines, Cowie notes that in response to the impossibility proof, realists can, of course, just reject one of the 5 propositions. But now, he says, this creates an epistemological problem. There's a problem of epistemic security. Suppose you were to come to believe that 1 + 1 = 2 is not true. Right? Maybe God comes down from heaven and informs you that you were mistaken about this all this time. Well, this would totally undermine all of your other mathematical beliefs, because it would render you unable to trust any of your mathematical judgments. After all, if you don't know that 1 + 1 = 2, what mathematical facts do you know? 1 + 1 = 2 seemed as secure as any mathematical judgment could possibly be. If you're wrong about that, then your basic belief-forming methods with respect to mathematics must be utterly compromised. So you should suspend judgment across the board. In the same way, Cowie suggests that each of the 5 propositions in the impossibility proof have an extremely high degree of epistemic security. Taken individually, they each seem as secure as any moral claim could be. But a realist must conclude that you're wrong about one of them, at least one of them. And if you're wrong about one of them, this calls into question the reliability of your belief-forming methods with respect to morality. And this leaves us with a kind of moral skepticism, right? Maybe there are moral truths, maybe there are moral facts, but we just can't know what any of them are. In any case, as before, if this is right, then we might say this shifts the burden of proof back onto the, at least away from the anti-realist. Maybe not onto the realist, but at least away from the anti-realist. At least, that's so. We might present this kind of argument in a more kind of concessive manner, not so much as a direct argument for anti-realism, but maybe more as a challenge, more as a way of, like I say, shifting the burden of proof. So that's the argument for the argument from moral incoherence. I don't think the incoherence argument is anything even approaching a knockdown argument against moral realism. There are countless ways the realist can respond to this, but it does raise a challenge. I think the best way to see it is as one challenge among a battery of challenges, such as the queerness argument and the evolutionary debunking argument. No doubt a realist will be optimistic that all the apparent inconsistencies can be removed without doing too much violence to our deep moral intuitions. By contrast, the anti-realist will probably look at the various different sources of apparent inconsistencies and the continual failure, despite decades of careful work, to come up with a satisfactory way of removing them. At the very least, the anti-realist can perhaps gain some points in the debate if we can throw doubt on whether the realist is even asserting anything coherent. So that's it. That's the argument, and that is all for today. So I hope you found that interesting. Goodbye.